They called her crazy. They called her useless. They laughed at the woman on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from the ground like they were gold. But when the beetles came, when they swept through Ash Hollow like a black wave and swallowed every garden hole, it was that same woman, Maeve Holloway, who stood between 300 people and a slow, silent death. And what did they do when she tried to save them? They threatened her. They lied about her. They nearly destroyed the only hope they had left. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. This one will stay with you. The Valley of Ash Hollow sat between two long ridges of pale limestone, like something cupped in an open hand, sheltered, green in spring, brutal in winter, and utterly isolated from everything that might have made life easier. There was no railroad stop within 40 miles. The nearest town with a proper doctor, a dry goods store, and a post office that functioned reliably was a full day's hard ride east, and that was in good weather. In bad weather, Ash Hollow was simply alone. 37 families had built their lives there over the past 11 years. They had broken the earth together, buried children together, survived a flood in 1869 that swallowed 4 homesteads whole. They were the kind of people who believed that survival was a matter of discipline. Straight rows of corn, staked bean plants, properly turned soil, predictable seeds from a reliable merchant. Order was survival. Order was everything. And then there was Maeve Holloway. She was 26 years old, broad-shouldered, with thick dark hair that refused to stay pinned and hands permanently stained green at the knuckles. She was, by most of the valley's standards, a peculiar woman. Not dangerous peculiar, not troublesome peculiar. Just the kind of peculiar that made a person the subject of quiet conversations over back fences and politely lowered voices at Sunday gatherings. That Holloway woman was in the creek bed again this morning. Clara Voss had told half the valley just 3 weeks ago, her voice carrying the particular tone of a woman delivering important news. On her hands and knees, filling a basket with, well, I couldn't say exactly what. Weeds, mostly. Roots. Lord knows what else. I saw her Tuesday past the South Ridge, added Dot Pruitt, nodding with great conviction. Talking to herself, or to the plants, I couldn't tell which. Clara had shaken her head slowly, the way a person shakes their head when they've accepted a sad truth about the world. Caleb Mercer married a good piece of farmland and got himself a wife who won't touch a plow. That's a hard thing for a man. Nobody disagreed, because the valley had a way of measuring a woman's worth by the quality of her kitchen garden, and Maeve Holloway had no kitchen garden to speak of. Her plot behind the house was half wild, deliberately so, and the other half she used to press and dry and catalog plants that nobody else could identify. Her shelves were filled not with preserves and pickled vegetables, but with paper bundles tied with twine and small clay pots sealed with wax, each one labeled in her precise, slanted handwriting. Nettles, young shoots, dry and steep, good for iron, wild garlic mustard, April through June, bitter raw, gentle, cooked. Lamb squarters, treat like spinach, more nourishing than spinach. Ground plum, do not confuse with purple vetch. The difference is the pod. She had started this practice as a young girl, following her grandmother through the hills of eastern Tennessee before her family had moved west. Her grandmother had been a quiet, careful woman who knew the name and use of nearly every plant that grew in rocky soil. And she had passed that knowledge to Maeve the way other grandmothers passed down quilt patterns and bread recipes. Slowly, with repetition, with stories attached to each lesson so the knowledge would stick. The land always provides, her grandmother had told her once, crouching to press a torn lamb's ear leaf to Maeve's scraped knee. Even when it looks like it's given up, it hasn't. You just have to know where to look. Maeve had never forgotten that. She had carried it west with her, tucked beneath everything else. The practical knowledge, the eye for detail, the willingness to crouch in the mud and look carefully at something most people stepped over without a second glance. Her husband, Caleb Mercer, was a decent man in the way that some men are decent, meaning he never struck her, never drank away their savings, never failed to work hard from dawn until the light failed. He was tall and angular, with sun-darkened skin and quiet gray eyes, and he had genuinely believed when he married Maeve that her strangeness was something that would soften with time and the demands of keeping a home. It had not softened. If anything, it had deepened. He never said cruel things to her directly. That wasn't his way. But Maeve had learned to read his silences the way she read the landscape, the slight tightening around his mouth when she came home with a basket of plants instead of yardage from the dry goods wagon, the careful way he looked away when neighbors made comments at the communal well. "You could try a kitchen garden," he said one evening in early spring, his tone measured and neutral, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "Even a small one. Just enough that people see you're contributing." Maeve was pressing a specimen of shepherd's purse between two boards wrapped in cloth, adding weight to flatten it. She didn't look up either. "I contribute," she said. "I know you do." He paused. "But people don't see what they can't recognize." It was the closest Caleb ever came to saying they're laughing at you. And Maeve heard the full meaning clearly, because she always heard the full meaning. She simply had long ago decided that other people's laughter was their problem, not hers. What occupied her mind more seriously in those early spring weeks wasn't the opinion of Clara Voss or Dot Pruitt or anyone else at the communal gatherings. What occupied her mind was the land itself, and the land was telling her something she didn't yet fully understand. It started with the birds. In late March, Maeve had noticed the sparrows behaving differently. Not dramatically. Nothing you would notice unless you spent long hours outdoors and had trained yourself to pay attention to the ordinary. But the birds were moving earlier in the morning, and they were moving low, skimming the grasses in wide, sweeping arcs, working the ground more intensively than she had observed in previous years. She had crouched in the field for nearly an hour one morning, watching, and finally understood what they were hunting. The ground was moving, not visibly, not yet, but something was happening beneath the surface. She pressed her palm flat to the earth near the edge of her south field and felt the faintest vibration, like the memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. She dug carefully with 2 fingers. The soil crumbled away and she found them. Larvae. Hundreds of them, dense and pale in the dark earth, clustered in a mass that made her stomach tighten. She identified them within a moment. Diabrotica undecimpunctata, spotted cucumber beetle in its larval stage, feeding on root systems below the frost line. She had seen them before, in small numbers, and had always considered them a manageable nuisance. But this was not small numbers. She moved across 3 different plots that afternoon, checking soil at the edge of established garden beds. The infestation was everywhere she looked, deep, widespread, and moving upward as the earth warmed. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote careful notes in her field journal. Then she sat for a long time, looking at what she'd written, understanding the shape of what was coming the way a person understands approaching weather by watching how smoke moves from a chimney. The cultivated crops were going to be devastated. She was nearly certain of it. She told Caleb first. "The soil is infected," she said, setting her journal open on the table in front of him after supper. "Larvae. Multiple species. The concentration is... Caleb, it's unlike anything I've seen. And the soil temperature is rising faster than usual this week. When it hits threshold, they'll emerge." Caleb looked at the sketches she had made, the careful notations. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Where exactly did you find this?" 3 fields. The Voss South plot, the old Pruitt bean rows, and our own eastern edge. If it's in those 3, it's almost certainly... "You were in the Voss fields?" His voice shifted slightly. "The boundary edge only. I wasn't..." "Maeve." He set the journal down. "I can't go to Thomas Voss and tell him his fields are infected based on you digging in the dirt at the edge of his property line." "You don't have to. I can tell him." That's, He stopped. "That's worse, actually." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them. "Because Thomas Voss will look at you, and he will hear his wife talking, and what Clara Voss says about you is not..." He stopped again. "Not favorable," Maeve finished for him. "I'm not saying you're wrong," Caleb said carefully. "I'm saying that even if you're right, the way you'd have to convince people would require them to already trust you. And right now, they don't." "No." She picked up her journal and closed it. "Then I'll go to James Hartley." Hartley was the closest thing Ash Hollow had to an agricultural authority, a former farmer from Illinois who had studied briefly at a land-grant college and was widely considered the most educated man in the valley. "He'll at least look at the specimens." Caleb looked almost relieved. "Yes, that's better. If Hartley says something..." "If Hartley repeats what I've already told him," Maeve said, not bitterly, just accurately, People will listen. Caleb had no answer for that, because they both knew it was true. She visited Hartley the next morning. He was a tall, formal man in his mid-50s, with a silver beard trimmed with great precision and the mild, patient expression of someone who had learned to absorb information without immediately reacting to it. He received Maeve in his study, which was more properly a farming office. Maps on the walls, seed catalogs stacked in organized towers, a large desk covered in correspondence. He listened. He examined her specimens in their small labeled jars. He read her notes slowly, turning pages with deliberate care. Then he set everything down and looked at her over the tops of his spectacles. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I appreciate your thoroughness, and I won't pretend your observations aren't detailed." A brief pause. "But beetle pressure is a normal part of a spring season. Farmers account for it. A few larvae in the soil is hardly a cause for—" "This is not a few," Maeve said. "I collected those samples from less than a square foot of soil. The density is approximately 40 to 60 larvae per square foot in the areas I tested. At that concentration, when they emerge." "When did you acquire this knowledge of larval density thresholds?" He didn't say it unkindly, but the question itself was the point. Maeve held his gaze. "From reading," she said, "and from watching. I've been watching this valley for 6 years." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Well, I will. Make a note of your concerns. And I'll take a look myself when I'm out that direction." He did not look that direction. Or if he did, he never told her what he found. Spring deepened, and Maeve watched the land with the particular anxiety of someone who knows what is coming and cannot make anyone else believe them. She used that time to do what she knew how to do. While the valley's women planted beans and squash and corn in their careful rows, Maeve walked the boundaries of Ash Hollow with her gathering basket and her journal, mapping every wild edible she could find within a 2-mile radius. She noted what was thriving, what was accessible, what would be ready to harvest, and when. She found more than she expected. The creek beds were dense with watercress and young cattail shoots. The south-facing slopes held wild onion and wood sorrel and 3 varieties of edible clover. In the shadowed hollows near the limestone outcroppings grew ramps, wild leeks, in quantities she hadn't previously noticed, their broad, flat leaves pushing up through leaf litter in great green drifts. Along the fence lines and disturbed earth where no one planted deliberately, lamb's quarters, purslane, dandelion in its most nutritious early form. She tasted everything she collected. She pressed specimens. She wrote quantities and locations in the back pages of her journal like a woman making a map to buried treasure. Because that was exactly what it was. The emergence happened on a Tuesday in late April. Maeve was at the creek when she heard the first shout, a man's voice, raw with alarm, from somewhere north of her position. She gathered her basket and walked quickly toward the sound, already knowing what she would find. They were everywhere. The beetles had come up from the soil overnight, emerging in the warming morning air in numbers that no one in Ash Hollow had ever witnessed in their years of farming. They moved across garden beds in shifting, clicking masses, their bodies catching the low spring sunlight in flashes of greenish yellow. The sound of them was a sound Maeve would remember for the rest of her life. A rustling, persistent, intimate sound, like rain falling on dry leaves, except that it was alive and eating. She stood at the edge of the Hartley property and watched a full row of young corn disappear in the time it took her to count to 100. Thomas Voss was running between his rows with his hat, uselessly swatting. His wife Clara stood at the fence with both hands pressed to her mouth. Old Herschel Burke had dragged out a smoke pot from somewhere, and the smoke drifted white and useless across his ruined bean plants. Caleb found Maeve standing at the edge of their own field. "How bad is it?" he asked. She looked at their eastern rows. The beetles had reached them already. "Bad," she said. "The corn is gone. The beans will be gone by evening. The root vegetables are partially protected underground, but the tops will be stripped, and without tops, the tubers won't develop properly." "What do we do?" Maeve bent and lifted a single lamb's quarter plant from the edge of the field, a plant she had left deliberately, growing unharvested where most farmers would have pulled it as a weed. The beetles swarmed the corn 6 inches away. Not one of them touched the lamb's quarter. She held it up. "We do what I've been preparing for," she said. He looked at the plant in her hand. Then he looked at her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not agreement exactly, not yet, but something cracking open that had been closed for a long time. A recognition. "Will it be enough?" he asked quietly. Maeve looked out across the valley, at the fields being taken apart plant by plant, at the families running and shouting and already beginning to panic. "Not if I do it alone," she said. The valley meeting was called that same evening. 22 men assembled in Hartley's barn, their faces lit by lanterns, already arguing before Hartley had finished opening remarks. The women gathered outside, listening through the boards, which was the valley's unofficial arrangement, present enough to be consulted if needed, distant enough to be dismissed if inconvenient. Inside, the men debated abandonment. The word hung in the air with a terrible weight. 3 families were already talking about moving east before the summer ended. Hartley was cataloging losses. 40% of corn gone on the first day, every young bean planting destroyed, the squash and gourd starts annihilated. "We'll need to send riders to purchase emergency stores," one man said. Mason Creek, maybe even to Platte City." "With what money?" asked another. "I've got less than $11 to my name until harvest." "There's not going to be a harvest," said Thomas Voss flatly. Silence. Through the barn boards, Maeve listened. And then she did something that took more courage than anything she had done in 6 years of frontier living. She walked around to the barn door, knocked once, and opened it. 22 men turned to look at her. "I have something to say," Maeve said. There was a pause of the particular quality that happens when a social rule has been broken and no one is sure yet how to respond. Hartley cleared his throat. Herschel Burke looked at the floor. Caleb, standing against the far wall, went very still. "Mrs. Holloway," Hartley began. "I know what you think," she said, stepping fully inside. "I'm aware of what the valley says about me. I've been aware of it for years." She looked around the barn slowly. "What I'd like you to be aware of is that your fields are gone, and you have children who need to eat before winter, and I know where the food is." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. "What food?" Thomas Voss asked, and his voice was stripped of its usual authority, down to something raw underneath. "Where?" Maeve set her basket on the nearest flat surface, the edge of a hay bale, and began to remove what she'd gathered that afternoon. Bundles of fresh lamb's quarters, a jar of ramp bulbs, watercress in a dampened cloth, purslane, wild onion, wood sorrel, ground plum pods, small and pale green. "This," she said, "this is what grows here that the beetles won't touch. And there is enough of it, within walking distance of this valley, to keep every family fed until the weather breaks. But only if you let me teach you what I know." She looked at the faces in the lantern light, skeptical, frightened, proud, and hungry. She looked at her husband, who was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before and couldn't quite name. "I've been learning this for 20 years, she said. "I've been learning it specifically here for 6. I have maps, I have quantities, I have recipes your children will actually eat." A pause. "What I need from you is to set down what you think you know about me long enough to learn something that might save your families." Thomas Voss looked at the wild plants spread across the hay bale. He looked at his hat in his hands. "What's that one?" he asked, pointing to the lamb's quarters. "That," Maeve said, "is the plant that was growing at the edge of your south field the whole time you were planting corn next to it. You pulled it as a weed." She held a bunch of it up. "It's more nourishing than anything you lost today." Voss stared at it for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice emptied of its pride, "Show me." And Maeve Holloway, the woman the entire valley had quietly agreed was its greatest embarrassment, picked up her basket, squared her shoulders, and began. Thomas Voss was not a man accustomed to being taught things. He was 51 years old, had farmed the same Illinois soil for 20 years before coming west, and carried his experience the way some men carry a weapon, visibly, and with the expectation that others would notice and step aside. So when he asked Maeve to show him, the word itself cost him something. Everyone in that barn understood that. Even Maeve understood it, and she was careful not to let her face show anything that might embarrass him further. She laid the plants out one by one on the hay bale, naming each in plain language. No Latin, no ceremony. The men gathered closer than she expected. Some crossed their arms at first. Herschel Burke, red-faced and stubborn, stayed near the back wall with his hat pulled low. But even the resistant ones were listening. Hunger has a way of quietly dismantling pride, the way water dismantles stone. Not all at once, just steadily, over time, until the thing you were certain was solid turns out to have been hollow in the middle. Lamb's quarters, Maeve said, holding up the first bunch. Some of you have been pulling this out of your garden beds for years. I understand why. It looks like nothing. It behaves like a weed. But this plant is richer in iron than beef liver, richer in calcium than milk, and the beetles won't touch it because it coats its own leaves with a fine powder that disrupts their feeding. You can boil it like spinach, fry it in whatever fat you have left, or eat the young leaves raw. It has almost no flavor to speak of, which means your children won't fight you on it. A few men exchanged glances. Not convinced, not yet, but listening. She moved to the ramp bulbs. Wild leeks. The whole plant is edible. Bulb, stem, leaf. Stronger than a kitchen onion in flavor, which means a small amount goes a long way in a pot. I found 3 large stands of them this afternoon, within half a mile of where we're standing. One stand alone could feed every family in this valley for 2 weeks if we harvest responsibly, meaning we don't take everything at once. How do we know which ones are safe? Asked a young man near the door. Jesse Pruitt, Dot's eldest boy, 19 and serious-faced. My mother says half the plants in the creek beds will make you sick. Your mother's right to be cautious, Maeve said, and she meant it without condescension. Which is why I'm going to teach every person in this valley to identify each plant before they touch it. And I'm going to walk them through it in person, not just describe it. There are lookalikes for some of these that are harmful. The difference is always visible if you know what to look for, and I will teach you what to look for. She paused. That's the entire point. She looked around the barn. I'm not asking you to trust what I say. I'm asking you to come out tomorrow morning and watch me do it, and then try it yourself, and then make your judgment based on what you see. The meeting broke up without a formal resolution, which was the valley's way of agreeing to something without any single man having to publicly commit to it. But the following morning, when Maeve walked out to the South Creek bed at 6 o'clock with her basket, she found 11 people waiting for her. Not 11 men. The men, for the most part, had not come, but 11 women and 14 children stood in the early morning light, their own baskets in hand, their faces ranging from cautiously hopeful to openly desperate. Clara Voss was there, which surprised Maeve until she thought about it. Clara was a woman who positioned herself near whatever was happening, either to participate or to report back. Either way, she had come. Maeve did not comment on who was absent. She simply began. She spent 4 hours that first morning teaching identification. She moved slowly, deliberately, holding each plant up in the light, describing the key features with precision, the shape of the leaf margin, the color of the stem interior when snapped, the smell when the leaf was crushed. She made each woman and each child find their own specimen and show it to her before adding it to their basket. When young Pearl Burke brought her a plant that wasn't lamb's quarters, but looked close enough to fool someone unfamiliar, Maeve sat with her for 10 minutes, side by side in the grass, until Pearl could see the difference herself. Now you'll never mistake them again, Maeve told her. Because I found it myself, Pearl said. Exactly. By the end of that first morning, every woman present had filled her basket with food that had been growing unnoticed at the edges of their failing world, and not one of them had picked anything dangerous. Maeve brought them back to her own kitchen and spent the afternoon teaching 3 methods of preparation: fresh, cooked, and dried for storage, while children tasted each version with the absolute candor of children, making faces or nodding approvingly, which told Maeve more than any adult review could. It's not terrible, Clara Voss said, chewing a spoonful of braised lamb quarters with onion, her expression the complex arrangement of a woman who has found something to be better than she hoped and doesn't want to say so outright. High praise, said Maeve, and Clara almost smiled. Word moved through the valley the way it always did, quickly and imperfectly. By the following day, 17 women had come to Maeve's door, and by the 3rd day she was holding 2 separate sessions, morning and afternoon, to accommodate everyone. She had begun using her maps, the ones she'd drawn in the back pages of her journal, to assign harvest areas, making sure no single plant stand was stripped before it could regenerate. She had also begun something she hadn't initially planned but found herself doing naturally, writing things down for the women to take home. Not formal documents, just small papers folded neatly with the name of each plant, its key identifying features, and its simplest preparation. She wrote them at the kitchen table after supper each night by the last of the candle, while Caleb sat across from her in a silence that had gradually shifted in its quality, less uncomfortable, more thoughtful. "How many families came today?" he asked one evening. 14 different households, 22 women total." She dipped her pen. "The Garrity girls came without their mother. I sent enough home to feed the whole family." A pause. "Their father was at the meeting. He was one of the ones who didn't come the next morning." "I know," Maeve said. "You're feeding him anyway." "I'm feeding his children," she said without looking up. "He's incidental." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "I should have told Hartley to listen to you. When you came to me with the soil samples." Maeve set down her pen. She looked at him. In 6 years of marriage, she had learned that Caleb's apologies came sideways, embedded in statements that sounded like observations but weren't. "You believed me," she said. "You just didn't believe anyone else would." "That's not—" He stopped. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "But it's an explanation, and I'll take the explanation." He nodded slowly. Something in his posture changed, not dramatically, but with the quiet permanence of a man who has decided something about himself and knows it will hold. The days developed a rhythm. Maeve rose before dawn to walk the harvest areas and check what was ready. She held her morning teaching session at the creek. She returned home to prepare, write, and plan the afternoon session. After supper, she wrote her notes for the next day and went to bed exhausted in the satisfying way of someone who has spent their energy on exactly the right thing. The valley's food situation was stabilizing. It wasn't plenty. Nobody had plenty. But the acute panic of the first days after the beetle emergence was receding. Families that had been talking about abandoning their homesteads were talking instead about the best way to dry lamb's quarters for winter storage. Children who had gone to bed hungry were going to bed fed, on food that Maeve had been studying for 2 decades, and the valley had been ignoring for just as long. But not everyone was grateful. Raymond Cutler had not come to any of Maeve's sessions. He was 43, broad-necked, and deliberate in his opinions. A man who had crossed paths with Maeve several times over the years, and each time arrived at the same conclusion. She was strange, her methods were unnatural, and there was something vaguely offensive about a woman who seemed to enjoy being different. He had said, at the original meeting in Hartley's barn, that he didn't see any reason to get worked up about a few beetles, and that any valley worth its salt could survive a rough season without turning to, and here he had gestured vaguely, unconventional measures. Now his kitchen garden was stripped bare, and his wife Ellen had been attending Maeve's sessions for 4 days without his knowledge, bringing food home and describing it to him as whatever I managed to find. He had not questioned this, because Raymond Cutler was also a man who could locate available comfort and not examine it too closely. But others had seen Ellen Cutler at the creek, and the information found its way to Raymond. He came to the Holloway property on a Thursday afternoon, while Maeve was in the middle of a session with 8 women and a cluster of children. He stood at the fence line rather than coming to the door, a choice that said everything about his intentions, and called across the yard in a carrying voice, "Mrs. Holloway, a word." The women went quiet. The children felt the change in atmosphere the way children do, and drifted closer to their mothers. Maeve straightened from where she had been crouching beside the herb beds and turned to face him. "Mr. Cutler, I'd like to know," he said, his voice pitched for the audience he knew was listening, "what qualifications you have to be instructing the families of this valley on what to eat and what not to eat." "The same qualifications I always had," Maeve said pleasantly. 20 years of study and practice." "Study." He repeated the word with a particular inflection. "Where? At what institution?" "From my grandmother, from books, from 6 years of watching this specific land." She met his eyes without difficulty. "Would you like to compare notes, Mr. Cutler?" "I'm happy to." His jaw tightened. "My concern is that women are feeding their children things you've collected from creek banks and roadsides on your say-so with no authority behind it whatsoever." "My say-so and 6 years of watching this specific land," Maeve repeated, still pleasant. "And the fact that every family who has followed my instruction has eaten safely. And the fact that the children here today are healthier than they were 2 weeks ago, which you're welcome to ask any of their mothers." "She's right," said Clara Voss from behind Maeve, with a firmness that surprised everyone, including Clara herself. "My children have eaten well. I've eaten well. And I have not been ill." Raymond looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the composed expression of a woman who has made a decision. He turned back to Maeve. "I'll be watching," he said. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it wasn't nothing. "I'd expect nothing less," Maeve said. He left. The session resumed, but Maeve noticed that when she turned back to her students, several women were looking at her with something new in their expressions. Not just gratitude, but something closer to solidarity, the kind that forms when women watch one of their number hold a line against pressure and not yield. She filed that look away. She had a feeling she would need to remember it. The men began coming in the second week. Not all of them, not with any great ceremony. But the hunger that had quietly dismantled Thomas Voss in the barn was working its way through other men in other houses, and eventually practicality outweighs pride, as it always has. Jesse Pruitt came first, citing his mother's suggestion and his own genuine curiosity about the plant identification. He was a fast learner, and Maeve recognized it immediately, setting him to work helping the younger children find specimens while she moved between the adults. Then old Herschel Burke appeared one morning at the creek bed, hat pulled low, hands in his pockets, studying the ground with great concentration as though he had wandered there by accident and was merely observing. Maeve handed him a bunch of watercress without comment, showed him the identifying vein pattern, and moved on. When she looked back 10 minutes later, he was crouching in the water up to his boot ankles, filling a basket with focused efficiency. "You're doing it right," she told him as she passed. "Don't make a thing of it," he said gruffly. "I wouldn't dream of it," she said. James Hartley came on the 9th day. He came in the afternoon alone, and he came to the door rather than calling across the fence, which Maeve registered as meaningful. She brought him inside and showed him her maps, her notes, her specimen collection. He asked careful questions. He tasted the lamb squarter's preparation she offered without being asked twice. He was quiet for a long time. "I should have listened to you in the spring," he said at last. "You listened to what you already knew," Maeve said. "That's a human thing." "It's a costly thing in this case." "Yes." She didn't soften it. "It was." He nodded. "What can I do?" She looked at him, this tall, formal man with his silver beard and his college-educated caution, and understood that he was offering something genuine. His endorsement carried weight she didn't have on her own, and both of them knew it. "Tell the men who still aren't coming that you've looked at my methods and you find them sound," she said. "You don't have to praise me. Just say what you believe." He said it. And 6 more men appeared at the creek the next morning. The valley was not saved. Not yet, not completely. The harvest failure was real, and the winter ahead was long, and the food Maeve could teach them to gather, while genuinely nourishing, required daily effort in a way that stored grain did not. There were hard days. There were families she visited who had too much pride left to do what they needed to do, and she had to find ways around that pride. Leaving bundles of prepared food at doors, sending children with baskets as though it were a social call, asking Jesse Pruitt to suggest things casually to his neighbors rather than have it come from her. She was building something more complex than a food supply. She was building a kind of trust that the valley had never extended to her before, and she was building it carefully, aware that it was fragile in ways that wild plants were not. Plants followed their own rules: light, water, soil, season. People followed something harder to predict, something shaped by fear and memory, and the deep, stubborn need to believe that the things they had always done were the right things to do. But they were learning, and she was learning too. That the knowledge she carried, which she had sometimes felt as a strange and isolating weight, was not a burden at all. It was a bridge. It had always been a bridge. She had simply been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for the valley to be ready to cross it. On the 14th evening, after the beetle emergence, Maeve sat on the front step of the Holloway house and looked out across the valley in the long golden light of a late spring sunset. The fields were ruined, bare and brown where green rows should have stood. But the creek glittered in the distance, and the south slopes were rich with movement, women and their older children making the last evening harvest before dark. Caleb sat down beside her. He looked at the same landscape she was looking at. "Jesse Pruitt told me today that his family hasn't gone to bed hungry once since you started," he said. Maeve nodded. "There are still people who aren't coming," he said. "Raymond Cutler, the Hadley brothers." "There are always people who aren't coming," she said, "until they are." He was quiet. Then, "I'm proud of you." She looked at him. He was watching the valley, not her, but his voice had been honest in the way voices are when a person stops measuring what they say against what sounds appropriate. "I know," she said, and then, because it was true. "That matters to me." They sat together in the fading light, watching the women work the hillside, the children darting between them like quick, bright fish. The valley looked the same as it always had. The pale limestone ridges, the long grass bending in the evening wind, the thin thread of creek catching the last of the light. And underneath the surface of it, in the dark soil, the beetles were still feeding. The damage was already done, but something else was happening too, something that had never happened in Ash Hollow before, something that had started in a lantern-lit barn when a woman with stained hands carried a basket of weeds to a hay bale and said, "This is where the food is." It was growing, quietly, steadily, in the way that the strongest things always grow it. Not with noise, not with announcement, but with the patient certainty of something that has found the right conditions at last. The trouble began with a child. His name was Daniel Pruitt, Jesse's younger brother, 8 years old, small for his age, with the kind of wiry restlessness that made him difficult to keep indoors. He had been present at several of Maeve's sessions, not as a student exactly, but as the particular kind of observant child who absorbs information sideways, by proximity, the way a cloth absorbs water without being told to. His mother Dot had brought him along because leaving him home meant coming back to discover he had disassembled something important. On a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week after the beetle emergence, Daniel Pruitt woke with a fever. By itself, this was not unusual. Children in frontier settlements ran fevers the way they ran everywhere else, frequently, energetically, and with little warning. The spring season brought its own catalog of seasonal illnesses, and a child with a high temperature and a flushed face was a familiar anxiety, not a crisis. Dot Pruitt sat with him through the night, changed his cloths, gave him water, and sent Jessie to the creek early to tell Maeve she wouldn't be at the morning session. The fever broke on the 2nd day. Daniel ate a small supper and fell asleep with the deep, boneless sleep of a body that has fought something and won. By the 3rd morning, he was asking to go outside, which Dot took as the reliable sign of recovery it always was. None of this would have become anything at all, except for Edna Marsh. Edna Marsh was 58 years old and had lived in Ash Hollow for 9 years, which made her one of its longer-standing residents and, in her own estimation, one of its most reliable sources of important information. She was a small, precise woman with quick eyes and a memory for detail that would have served her well in a profession that valued such things. Instead, she had channeled it entirely into the social architecture of the valley, who had said what to whom, which families were struggling, which marriages showed signs of strain, which children were being raised without proper supervision. She did not consider this gossip. She considered it community awareness. She had watched Maeve's growing influence over the past 3 weeks, with an expression that stayed carefully neutral in public and was considerably less neutral in private. It wasn't precisely jealousy, though jealousy was threaded through it. It was more that Edna Marsh had spent 9 years being the person this valley turned to when it needed to understand itself, and now that function was being performed by Maeve Holloway, a woman Edna had spent considerable effort establishing as unreliable, and the architecture of her position was developing cracks. She heard about Daniel Pruitt's fever on the 2nd morning of it, from a woman who had heard from another woman who had passed the Pruitt homestead and noticed the curtains drawn in daylight, which in a frontier settlement is the universal signal that something is wrong inside. Edna visited Dot that afternoon, ostensibly to offer help. She sat with Dot in the kitchen, drank the thin tea Dot offered, and asked careful questions in the sympathetic voice she had perfected over decades of careful questions. When did it start exactly? Tuesday night. He was fine at supper and then by midnight, and he'd been at Maeve Holloway's sessions. With you. Dot looked up. Yes, but... And he ate what she prepared? The wild plants? We all did. I did. Jessie did. We're all perfectly fine. Of course, Edna said, her tone suggesting the opposite of certainty. Of course you are. I'm sure it's nothing connected. Children do run fevers. A pause, perfectly timed. Though I will say I've heard from Ellen Cutler that Raymond has had concerns about what exactly is being fed to the valley's children. He's not the only one. Raymond Cutler hasn't attended a single session, Dot said, with more sharpness than she intended. No, Edna agreed mildly. He hasn't. She left 30 minutes later, having said nothing that could be directly quoted and everything that needed to be implied. By evening, the story moving through Ash Hollow was that Dot Pruitt's boy had been made ill by something he ate at Maeve Holloway's teaching sessions. By the following morning, the story had thickened. The boy was seriously ill, had been unable to keep food down, and a reliable source, unnamed as reliable sources so often were, had suggested the wild plants Maeve was feeding people contained something harmful that she either didn't know about or hadn't mentioned. Maeve heard the rumor from Clara Voss, who came to the door on Thursday morning with the specific expression of someone delivering news they know will be unwelcome but feel obligated to deliver anyway. "I want you to know I don't believe it," Clara said, standing on the step. "I want to say that clearly at the outset. But I think you need to know what's being said." Maeve listened. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, not defensively, but with the stillness of someone receiving information and filing it accurately. And she let Clara tell her everything. The fever. The implication. Edna Marsh's name, which Clara offered with a brief, tight expression that communicated a complete and unflattering assessment without requiring additional words. When Clara finished, Maeve said, "Daniel Pruitt had a seasonal fever. He's recovering." "I know that. I'm telling you what people are saying, not what happened." "Where is it coming from, specifically?" Clara hesitated. "Edna talked to half a dozen women yesterday, and Raymond Cutler was at the mill this morning telling anyone who'd listened that he'd been saying all along that this would happen." "What exactly is he saying happened?" "That you poisoned a child." Clara said it plainly, because she was, underneath her social calculations, a practical woman. Not in those exact words, but that's what it amounts to. Maeve stood with that for a moment. Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere in the ruined field. The morning was clear and cool and entirely indifferent to the thing that was being built against her. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What are you going to do?" "Keep feeding people," Maeve said. Clara blinked. Is that wise? Should you not perhaps... What would you have me do instead?" "Stop? Let the families who depend on what I'm teaching go back to nothing, on the basis of a rumor that isn't true?" Maeve looked at her steadily. "I haven't poisoned anyone. Daniel Pruitt has a spring fever, the same kind of fever children have been getting in this valley since families first settled here. When he's well enough to come outside, everyone will see that. Until then, I keep working." Clara left without quite agreeing and without quite disagreeing, which was her way of saying she thought Maeve was right, but wasn't sure it was politically sound. By Friday, 4 families had stopped coming to the sessions. Maeve noticed the absences without commenting on them. She ran the morning session for the women who were still present, 11 of them, down from 22, and moved through the teaching with the same methodical attention she always brought, no faster, no slower. She answered every question fully. She tasted every preparation in front of the group, as she always did, which was something she had done from the beginning specifically because she knew there would come a time when it mattered. What she didn't do was talk about Daniel Pruitt. She didn't address the rumor directly, didn't reference it, didn't defend herself in the open air where her defense might be taken as proof of guilt. She had learned from a long time of being the subject of this valley's conversations that a woman defending herself against gossip in public rarely succeeded. Every word of defense became evidence of how rattled she was, which became evidence of a guilty conscience, which became part of the story. She had seen it happen to other women. She would not let it happen to her. Instead, she did 3 things quietly and with great deliberation. The first was to visit Dot Pruitt. She went on Friday afternoon alone, without announcement. She brought a small bundle of dried chamomile and a jar of clear broth she had made from wild onion and dried lamb's quarters, both mild, both recognized even by conventional understanding as appropriate for a recovering child. She knocked on the door and waited. Dot opened it with the expression of a woman who had been expecting either this visit or something worse, and was relieved to find it was this one. "He's better," Dot said immediately. "He ate a full supper last night." "I know. Jessie told me at the creek yesterday." Maeve held out the bundle. "This is for him. The broth is gentle. The chamomile is for you, if you haven't been sleeping." Dot looked at the offered items for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, and Dot poured water to heat. And for a little while, neither of them said the thing that was in the room with them. Then Dot said it. She went around telling people before he was even well, before anyone knew what it was. Her voice was quiet and precise with anger. He had a fever. He's had fevers before. He'll have them again. She walked out of my house and told the valley my son had been poisoned. I know, Maeve said. I told 3 women myself, Mary Garrity, Ellen Cutler, and Frances Hadley. I told them directly that his fever had nothing to do with your teaching. Frances actually said to me, and I am not making this up, she said, well, how would you know for certain? Dot set her cup down with a controlled precision that communicated exactly what she thought of Frances Hadley. How would I know? He's my child. Do you believe it had nothing to do with my food? Maeve asked. Dot looked at her directly. I believe it the same way I believe the sun comes up in the east, she said. I ate everything he ate. Jesse ate everything he ate. We're sitting here right now. Maeve nodded. I need a favor from you, Dot. Name it. When Daniel is well enough, tomorrow, if he's ready, I need you to bring him to the creek for the morning session. Not to work, just to be there, just so people can see him. Dot understood immediately. Yes, she said. We'll be there. The second thing Maeve did was write a letter. She had known for some time that there was a traveling doctor, a man named Aldous Webb, who made quarterly circuits through the frontier settlements in the region, carrying his black bag and his methodical training through valleys that otherwise went without medical attention for months at a stretch. He was due to pass through Ash Hollow sometime in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Maeve wrote to him at his last known stop, a settlement called Garner's Ford 20 miles east, and described Daniel Pruitt's symptoms precisely and completely. She asked him, when he arrived, to examine the boy and give his professional assessment of the fever's cause. She gave the letter to Jesse Pruitt to ride east with, which Jesse did without being asked twice, because Jesse was that kind of young man. The third thing was harder. Raymond Cutler had moved from implication to something closer to open accusation. At the mill, at the communal well, at the fence lines where men talked in the early mornings, he was saying clearly and with apparent conviction that Maeve Holloway had been reckless, that her methods were unproven, and that the valley had been foolish to let a woman with no real credentials feed their children experimental food during a crisis. He said it with the particular confidence of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity and feels certain he has finally found one. What Raymond did not account for was Caleb Mercer. Caleb had said little publicly since the Beetle emergence. He was not a man who sought the center of conversations, and in the past his silence on the subject of his wife had been read by the valley as a kind of tacit agreement with its assessment of her. He had never corrected that reading. He hadn't known how to, or perhaps hadn't been willing to try. But something had shifted in him in the 2 weeks since Maeve had walked into that barn with her basket, and the shift had been completing itself quietly, the way important changes in a person usually do, below the level of announcement. He found Raymond Cutler at the mill on Saturday morning. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He walked up to Raymond in the middle of a group of 4 men and said, in a caring and entirely level voice, Raymond, I need you to stop. Raymond looked at him. Stop what? Telling people my wife poisoned a child. Because she didn't. And you know she didn't. And continuing to say it is a lie, and I'm asking you to your face to stop telling it. The 4 men around them went very still in the way men go still when they understand something significant is happening. Raymond's face reddened. I'm expressing a reasonable concern about... You're expressing something you don't believe, Caleb said. Because if you believed it, you'd have gone to Dot Pruitt and said it to her face, and you haven't, because Dot would have told you exactly what she's told everyone else, which is that her boy has a fever, and it has nothing to do with Maeve. He paused. Your wife has been eating what my wife teaches, every day for 2 weeks. If there was something harmful, Ellen would be sick. She's not. The silence that followed was a complete and thorough kind. Raymond said nothing. He couldn't say nothing gracefully, so what filled the space instead was the particular awkwardness of a man whose argument has been taken apart in public by the person he least expected to take it apart. Herschel Burke, who was standing near the mill door, said, That's a fair point, Raymond. Raymond left shortly after. The story of what Caleb Mercer had said at the mill reached every corner of the valley by sundown, because that was how Ash Hollow worked, and this time Maeve was glad of it. Daniel Pruitt appeared at the creek on Saturday morning. He was pale and slightly thinner and had the luminous, slightly transparent look of a child recently recovered from illness. He sat on a flat rock near the water and watched the morning session with sharp eyes. And when Maeve crouched beside him and showed him the difference between two similar plants in the water, one edible, one merely harmless but tasteless, he studied them with the same focused seriousness he had always shown. "I knew you didn't make me sick," he told her, in the matter-of-fact way of a child stating the obvious. "Did you?" Maeve asked. "The fever started at midnight. I hadn't eaten your food since supper the night before. That's 12 hours. He looked at her. "Things that poison you don't wait 12 hours. She stared at him. "Where did you learn that?" "You said it," he said, 3 weeks ago, when you were teaching us the difference between bad mushrooms and good ones. You said the first signs from a harmful plant usually appear within 2 to 4 hours. So if someone gets sick 12 hours later, it isn't the plant." Maeve looked at this 8-year-old boy sitting on his rock in the morning light, reciting her own teaching back to her with the calm precision of a student who had been paying attention the whole time. "You're exactly right," she said. "I know," he said, and reached past her to pick a watercress leaf, examining its vein pattern with concentration. The sessions continued. The absences slowly reversed. Women who had stopped coming appeared again, one by one, most of them without explanation and without apology, which Maeve accepted without requiring either. The knowledge was more important than the apology. The food was more important than the acknowledgement. She let people return without ceremony, without the pointed look or the loaded silence that would have made return more difficult, because she understood that people needed a way back that didn't cost them more pride than they had already spent. But the damage was real and it persisted. 3 families never came back. The Hadley brothers remained convinced of something they could not quite articulate, that Maeve was dangerous in some way that the facts didn't support, but that their feelings insisted on. Raymond Cutler had stopped speaking openly against her, but his silence had the quality of a held breath rather than a concession. And Edna Marsh. Edna had gone very quiet, which was more unsettling than her noise had been, because a quiet Edna Marsh was an Edna Marsh who was recalculating. Maeve noticed all of it. She filed all of it, and she kept working. The wild food was carrying the valley. Every day, the evidence accumulated. Families fed, children healthy, the initial panic of the beetle emergence replaced by a functional daily rhythm of gathering and preparation. Maeve had begun teaching preservation in earnest, how to dry plants properly so they retain nutrition through storage, how to make a concentrated paste from lamb's quarters that could be sealed in rendered fat and kept through winter, how to braid wild onions for hanging, how to pack ramp bulbs in salt. She was building a winter pantry out of what the valley had always considered worthless, and she was building it against a clock, because summer was not permanent, and what could be gathered now could not be gathered in January. On a Tuesday evening in late May, she sat at the kitchen table with her maps spread out, calculating what had been harvested and what remained and what would need to happen between now and the first frost to give every family in Ash Hollow a genuine chance of surviving until spring. The numbers were close, not comfortable, not safe, but possible. Caleb sat down across from her and looked at the maps. "We're going to make it," he said. Not a question. "If nothing else goes wrong," Maeve said. She meant it as a practical assessment. She had no way of knowing, sitting at that table in the quiet evening, what was still waiting in the weeks ahead. That the hardest thing she would face in Ash Hollow was not the beetles, not the hunger, not even Edna Marsh. It was something older and more stubborn than all of them. The human capacity to hold on to fear long after the thing that caused it has been disproven, and to find new shapes for that fear when the old ones no longer fit. She knew it was coming. She could feel it the way she felt weather in the land, not yet visible, but present in the pressure of things. In the way certain silences had a particular weight to them. She had learned, over 26 years of being herself in a world that wasn't always prepared for her, that knowledge was never the whole answer. You could be right about everything and still lose, if the people around you were frightened enough and the person doing the frightening was clever enough. But she also knew something else. Something her grandmother had told her once in the Tennessee hills, crouched over a plant most people had never bothered to name. She had said, "The truth doesn't need your help to be true. It just needs time and a witness." Maeve had witnesses now, more than she'd had before, and she was running out of patience with waiting for time to do its work alone. Dr. Aldous Webb arrived in Ash Hollow on a Thursday morning in early June, his black bag strapped behind his saddle and his horse moving at the unhurried pace of an animal that has covered a great many miles in its life and has learned not to rush. He was a compact man in his mid-60s with a white mustache and the particular quality of stillness that some doctors develop over decades of sitting beside people in their worst moments. A stillness that communicated, without words, that he had seen most things and had not been destroyed by any of them. Jesse Pruitt met him at the Valley Road and rode with him to the Pruitt homestead, where Daniel was outside splitting kindling with the concentrated effort of a boy who has been told to take it easy and is taking it easy as aggressively as possible. Webb examined the boy thoroughly: chest, throat, eyes, skin, the precise catalog of a trained physician, and then sat with Dot at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, asking the same careful questions Maeve had already answered in her letter. When he came out, Maeve was waiting in the yard. She had not planned to be there. She had been passing the Pruitt property on her way back from the South Ridge harvest when she saw Webb's horse tied at the fence, and she had stopped. And then she had decided that stopping and waiting was more honest than pretending she hadn't seen and walking on. So she stood in the yard with her basket and her stained hands, and Webb came out and looked at her with the alert, unsentimental eyes of someone who has already been told a great deal about a situation and is forming his own assessment in real time. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Dr. Webb." He studied her for a moment. "You wrote to me." "I did." The letter was precise, accurate symptom timeline, clear description of onset, no editorializing. He paused. "That's not common in letters I receive from non-physicians." "I've been keeping observational records for 6 years, Maeve said. "I know what careful notation looks like." Webb almost smiled. The boy has a classic presentation of a spring respiratory fever, common to this region in years with high moisture and rapid temperature fluctuation, which this spring has had in abundance. I've seen 14 cases in the last 3 settlements I passed through. He looked at her steadily. "It has nothing to do with plant consumption. I would stake my license on it." Maeve felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully acknowledged was held tight. "Would you be willing to say that publicly?" "That's why I rode here today instead of sending a written reply," he said. The valley meeting that Webb called was not in Hartley's barn this time. It was at the communal well, the social center of Ash Hollow, the place where information moved fastest and carried the most weight, because everyone passed through it and no one could claim they hadn't heard. Webb stood on the stone mounting block beside the well and spoke in the level, carrying voice of a man accustomed to being listened to, and what he said was simple and complete and allowed for no comfortable misinterpretation. Daniel Pruitt's fever was a seasonal respiratory illness. He had seen it across the entire region this spring. It was caused by the particular conditions of this year's weather cycle and was entirely unrelated to anything the boy had eaten. He had examined the child thoroughly. He had reviewed the foods in question. Maeve had brought samples of everything Daniel had eaten in the 48 hours before the fever, which she had preserved and labeled with the same precision she brought to everything. And he found nothing in any of them that could produce the symptoms described. "If anything," he said, looking deliberately around at the assembled faces, "the nutritional profile of what this valley's children had been eating for the past 3 weeks was more complete than what most frontier settlements managed in their best years." The silence that followed was long and specific. It had different textures in different faces, relief in some, embarrassment in others, the stubborn blankness of people who have committed to a position and are not yet ready to visibly abandon it. Edna Marsh stood at the back of the gathering with an expression that Maeve, watching from a careful distance, could not entirely read. It was not guilt, exactly. People like Edna rarely felt guilt in the straightforward sense. They felt instead the inconvenience of having been publicly incorrect, which was a different and lesser thing. But there was something else underneath the inconvenience, a flicker of something that might, given time and the right pressure, become recognition. Raymond Cutler stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he did not look at Caleb Mercer, who was standing 12 feet away. Raymond was doing the internal arithmetic of a man who has said things he cannot unsay and is now calculating how long he needs to stay quiet before he can speak again without everyone remembering what he said before. Thomas Voss spoke first because Thomas Voss had been the first man to ask Maeve to show him, and having crossed that line 3 weeks ago, he found it marginally easier to cross the next one. He said, "I owe Mrs. Holloway an apology. Several, actually. I intend to make them directly." He looked around at the gathered valley. "I think some others here are in the same position." The silence shifted. It became less a silence of processing and more a silence of people deciding whether to move, the way a flock of birds will pause on a wire for a long suspended moment before lifting all at once. Herschel Burke cleared his throat. "I never believed the rumor," he said gruffly. "I want that noted." "You weren't exactly vocal about not believing it," Jessie Pruitt said, with the directness of a 19-year-old who has not yet learned to soften useful truths. Herschel looked at his boots. "No," he admitted. "I wasn't." Webb stayed 2 days, which was longer than his usual stop. Maeve spent most of that time with him, not by planning, but because Webb sought her out, interested in her specimen collection, her maps, her records. He was the first formally educated person who had engaged with her work without the preliminary condescension, without the careful way of listening that was actually a way of waiting to point out the limits of what she knew. He simply looked at what she had and asked questions. "This notation system," he said, paging through her field journal on the afternoon of the first day, "you developed this yourself?" "Based on something my grandmother used. I expanded it." "It's better than what I was taught in medical school." He said it flatly, as a fact. "Where did you study?" "Formally, I mean. Beyond your grandmother." "I didn't," Maeve said, "but books. My own observation." Webb looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once: admiration and something that was almost frustration, though not directed at her. "There are men with university chairs," he said carefully, "who know less about regional botany than what's in these pages." "I know," Maeve said. "That's never been my difficulty." He understood what she meant. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it hasn't." Before he left, Webb wrote 2 things. The first was a formal letter on his physician's stationery, addressed to the community of Ash Hollow, stating his professional findings regarding Daniel Pruitt's illness and his assessment of the wild food program Maeve had established. The letter was clear and authoritative and used the precise language of medical documentation, which gave it a weight that personal testimony did not have. He gave it to James Hartley, with the suggestion that it be read aloud at the next community meeting and then posted at the well. The second thing he wrote was a personal letter addressed to Maeve, and he handed it to her directly on the morning he rode out. "Don't read it until I'm gone," he said. "I find it easier to say certain things in writing." She waited until the sound of his horse had faded down the valley road, and then she opened it. It said that in 38 years of medical practice across 3 territories, he had rarely encountered anyone, regardless of training or credential, with the combination of observational precision, systematic thinking, and genuine practical knowledge that she had demonstrated in her work. It said that what she was doing in this valley deserved to be written down in a form that would outlast the current crisis. It said that if she was ever willing to correspond, he would be honored to be the person she corresponded with. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the front of her field journal, between the cover and the first page. Then she stood in the doorway of her house for a long moment, looking out at the valley in the early morning light, and felt something she recognized as a particular kind of grief. Not for what had been taken from her, but for the years she had spent carrying her knowledge alone, in silence, certain it was worthless to anyone but herself. She allowed herself that grief for exactly as long as it took to feel it fully. Then she picked up her basket and went to the creek. The work of rebuilding trust turned out to be slower and more unglamorous than Maeve had anticipated, and she had not anticipated it being glamorous. It happened in small moments rather than dramatic ones, in the way Thomas Voss started waiting for her at the boundary of his property on her morning circuit, not to talk exactly, but to walk alongside her and look at the land with the eyes she was teaching him to use. In the way Dot Pruitt began arriving at sessions 15 minutes early to help Maeve set up, handling the specimens and the preparation materials with a quiet proprietary care that communicated she had appointed herself unofficial assistant and was not looking for discussion on the matter. In the way Caleb began coming to the creek on Sunday mornings. He didn't present himself as a student. He came the way men of his type often enter something new, positioned just at the edge of it, carrying a tool or a task that gave his presence a practical justification. The first Sunday he carried a pail that needed mending, and he sat near enough to the session to hear everything while appearing to focus on the pail. The second Sunday, the pail was fine, but there was a fence stake that needed driving near the water's edge. By the third Sunday, he had run out of peripheral tasks and simply sat down with the group, his elbows on his knees, and asked a question about the difference between two varieties of wild mustard. Everyone pretended not to notice the significance of this. Maeve answered the question with the same precision she brought to every question. Jesse Pruitt, to his credit, did not remark on it until later, when he and Caleb were walking back up the valley road, and then he only said, "You're good with the plant identification. Quick." "I've been listening for a while," Caleb said. Jesse nodded. "Yeah, I noticed. The harder conversations were with the people who didn't come to the creek, the families who had stopped after the rumor and hadn't returned. Maeve didn't wait for them to find their way back. She went to them. She went to the Hadley brothers first, because they were the most straightforwardly practical of her resistors, not malicious in the way Raymond Cutler had been malicious, but stubborn in the way of men who have decided something and need a better reason to change than simply being shown they're wrong. She arrived at their property with a basket of prepared food and her maps, and she sat down with both brothers at their kitchen table. Frank and George, large, quiet men who looked at her with the identical wary expression of people bracing for a confrontation they don't want. And she didn't confront them. She showed them the maps instead, showed them exactly where the food was coming from, how much, what the yield would be through the remaining summer and into fall. She talked numbers, concrete estimates of caloric yield per acre of wild harvest compared to the ruined garden plot figures. And she watched both brothers' expressions shift from wariness to something more like genuine attention. "You calculated all this?" Frank Hadley asked. "Over the past 4 weeks, yes." He looked at the maps for a long moment. "We've got 2 children and my mother-in-law living here," he said. "She's 72. She can't be eating something that doesn't agree with her." "I know," Maeve said. "Which is why I've marked everything here." She pointed to a section of her notes. "With notes on who it's appropriate for. The tender young greens are easy on older digestion. The ramp bulbs are strong, and I'd introduce them slowly. The watercress is fine for anyone." She looked at him. "I wouldn't feed your mother-in-law anything I wouldn't feed my own." Frank looked at George. George looked at the maps. "All right," George said. "Show us where to start." Raymond Cutler was the last and the hardest, and Maeve didn't go to him at all. She let that one come to her. It came on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, when the summer was fully established, and the wild harvest was at its most abundant, and the valley had settled into the new rhythm that was beginning to feel almost like normalcy. Maeve was at the south slope with a group of 8, teaching the final stage of the lamb squirter's drying process, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Raymond standing 10 feet away, hat in his hands, looking at the ground. The group went quiet, the kind of quiet that has ears in it. Raymond looked up. His face was doing several things simultaneously, none of them comfortable. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I wonder if I could have a word." "Of course," Maeve said. She looked at the group. "Continue with the spacing. I want 2 inches between each bundle, not touching." She walked toward Raymond, far enough from the group for privacy, close enough that the conversation's existence was still visible. Raymond turned his hat in his hands. He was not a man who had practice with this particular kind of moment, and the lack of practice showed in every line of him. "I said things," he started, that I shouldn't have said, that weren't fair, and that weren't true as it turns out." A pause. "Though I want you to know that my concerns at the time were not, I wasn't trying to—" "Mr. Cutler," Maeve said quietly. He stopped. "I understand that you were frightened," she said. "The harvest failed. Your family was hungry. A stranger," she used the word deliberately, "was feeding your valley's children food you didn't recognize, and the stranger happened to be a woman that this valley had spent years deciding wasn't worth taking seriously. I understand exactly why that combination produced the response it did." He stared at her. He had clearly prepared for several versions of this conversation. This version was not among them. "What I need from you," Maeve continued, is not an apology, though I appreciate that you came to offer one. What I need is simple. I need you to stop being afraid of what you don't yet know. Because winter is coming, and I still have a great deal to teach, and I need every family in this valley to be listening. She held his gaze. Including yours. Raymond Cutler looked at her for a long moment. A man calculating, as men like him always calculated, but calculating something different now. Not advantage or position, but the simpler arithmetic of what was real and what he owed to it. Ellen's been coming to your sessions, he said. I knew. I let on that I didn't, but I knew. I know, Maeve said. She said you treated her well, even when… He stopped. Even when things were difficult. Your wife came to learn, Maeve said simply. That's all I asked of anyone. Raymond nodded slowly. Then he put his hat back on his head with the careful deliberateness of a man who has reached the end of something and is stepping into whatever comes next. Ellen said you haven't taught the winter storage method for ground plum yet. She's been waiting on it. Saturday afternoon, Maeve said. Tell her to come early. I'm going to need help with the pressing. He turned to go, then stopped. Without turning back, Mrs. Holloway, I'm sorry for what it's worth. It's worth something, she said. More than you think. He walked back up the slope without another word, and Maeve watched him go. And then she turned back to her group, where 8 pairs of hands had continued the drying work with studied concentration, and nobody mentioned what had just happened. And the afternoon continued in the golden, industrious way that the best of those summer afternoons had, full of small, necessary things stacked against the winter one careful layer at a time. The valley was not remade overnight. It was remade the way Maeve had always known things were remade. The way a creek cuts a new channel, the way a plant establishes itself in disturbed soil. The way knowledge moves from one person to the next until a skill that lived in a single woman's hands becomes something a whole community carries. Slowly, without announcement, with a patience that looks from the outside like nothing much is happening, and then one day the channel is there, the plant is established, and everyone acts as though it had always been that way. In the last week of June, James Hartley stood up at the communal well, the same place Webb had stood, the same place this valley had stood for 11 years deciding what to believe about itself, and read a proposal he had drafted with careful language and consulted with Maeve on before writing. He proposed that the valley formally adopt a standing program of wild plant education, to be led by Maeve Holloway, to be practiced by every family, and to be incorporated into their regular agricultural planning alongside conventional farming methods. The vote was not unanimous. It never was in Ash Hollow. But it passed. And what it passed with was something more meaningful than a majority count. It passed with the sound of people who had made a decision they intended to keep. Maeve sat in the back of the gathering and listened to the vote and thought about her grandmother in the Tennessee hills, crouched over a plant most people had never looked at closely enough to name. She thought about what it meant to carry knowledge for 20 years through a world that kept telling you it wasn't worth carrying. She thought about the winter ahead and the families who would move through it differently because of what they now knew, and the children who were learning to read the land the way previous generations had learned to read words, as a fundamental skill, a language, a way of understanding the world they lived in. She thought, it doesn't always come in time. Sometimes you spend your whole life knowing something that the world isn't ready to hear, and the world isn't ready until the very last moment, and sometimes not even then. But sometimes, not always, and not easily, and never without cost, sometimes it comes. The summer moved the way summers do in that country, with an intensity that made it feel permanent, as though heat and abundance were the natural condition of the world and everything else was temporary aberration. The wild harvest was generous in a way that surprised even Maeve, who had calculated conservatively and found that her conservative calculations had still underestimated what the land could give when people finally paid it proper attention. By July, the valley had developed what Maeve privately thought of as a new literacy. Women who had once walked past lamb's quarters without seeing it now stopped automatically, assessing the plant's stage of growth, calculating whether this stand should be harvested now or left another week to reach fuller yield. Children who had spent previous summers avoiding the creek banks were spending hours there with small baskets, bringing home watercress and wood sorrel with the proprietary pride of people who have learned to produce something from nothing. Even the men, even the ones who had arrived at this knowledge last and with the most reluctance, had begun to carry it in their bodies the way you carry a skill that has been practiced until it is no longer conscious effort, but simple reflex. Jesse Pruitt had become, by July, something very close to Maeve's right hand in the field. He had the combination of genuine intelligence and physical patience that made him exceptional at plant work. He could sit still long enough to observe, which was rarer than people acknowledged. Maeve had begun teaching him the more complex identifications, the ones that required understanding not just the visible plant, but its relationship to soil type and moisture and neighboring species. He absorbed it with the focused appetite of a young person who has discovered, unexpectedly, the thing they are meant to do. "You could go further with this than Ash Hollow," she told him one morning in late July, as they worked the north slope together. "If you wanted to." Jesse considered this without false modesty. "You mean learn more?" "I mean teach more. In other places." She straightened and looked at him. "What I've given you this summer, that's enough to help another settlement through a crisis. Not everything I know, but enough." He was quiet for a moment, his hands moving through the plants with the gentle efficiency she had taught him. "Are you thinking of going other places? Yourself?" "I've been thinking about it," she said, which was an understatement. Since Webb's visit, since the letter he had written her, she had been thinking about it with an intensity that kept her awake in the early mornings, lying in the dark and staring at the ceiling while Caleb slept beside her. The knowledge she carried was not just useful to Ash Hollow. It was useful to every settlement between the Missouri River and the Rockies, every family trying to survive on cultivated crops alone in a landscape full of food they had never learned to recognize. The question was not whether she should take it further. The question was how. Webb's letter had given her the beginning of an answer, and she had been corresponding with him through the summer, long, careful letters that carried the same precision as her field notes, and that he answered with the same seriousness. He had connections to other physicians making frontier circuits, to an agricultural society that published a quarterly journal reaching settlements across 3 territories, to a woman in Omaha who ran a practical education program for frontier families and had been looking, Webb said, for someone who could provide instruction in exactly the area Maeve had spent 20 years developing. She had not told Caleb about these letters yet, not because she was hiding them, but because she was still assembling the shape of the thing herself, and she didn't want to describe it to him until she understood what she was describing. Caleb deserved a real conversation, not a half-formed idea. She was still working out when to have it when the summer delivered its last test. The first frost came on the 14th of September, 3 weeks earlier than any year in the valley's recorded memory. Maeve woke to it before dawn, felt the change in the air through the single layer of the bedroom window, a coldness with a different quality than summer night cool, something with permanence in it. She dressed in the dark and went outside and stood in the yard and looked at the white rime on every surface and felt for a moment the old fear that lives beneath all careful preparation. The fear that it isn't enough, that you've miscalculated, that the margin you thought you had is smaller than you believed. She stood in that fear for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she went inside and began making a list. By the time the valley was awake and the alarm was moving from house to house, early frost, Maeve was already at the creek with Jesse and Dot Pruitt and Clara Voss and Thomas Voss and Caleb, and they were moving through the harvest areas with a focused urgency that was nothing like the panic of the Beetle days. This was not panic. This was practiced competence meeting an unexpected deadline, which is a different thing entirely, a thing that requires clear thinking rather than abandoning it. "The lamb's quarters on the south slope are still viable," Maeve said, moving quickly. "The frost didn't penetrate deep enough to damage the mature plants. We have today and maybe tomorrow before the next freeze hits and finishes them. Everything on the list. I need everyone who came to the sessions to be out today. All of them." "I'll go," Clara said immediately. "I'll take my girls. We can cover the creek bed section. The ramp stands near the North Limestone. Those need to come out today," Maeve said to Jesse. "Take Frank Hadley if he'll come. He knows the location." "He'll come," Jesse said, and he was already moving. Thomas Voss put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a whistle that carried across the valley like a shot, the signal they had established for community assembly. And within 20 minutes, there were people coming from every direction, women, children, men, with baskets and cloth bags and whatever vessels they could carry, moving toward the harvest areas with the purposeful, collective energy of people who know what they're doing and why it matters. Maeve moved between the groups all morning, checking, correcting, directing. She had never managed anything at this scale before, had always worked in smaller groups, in the careful back and forth of teaching. But this was not teaching. This was execution, and the teaching had already happened, and what she discovered over the course of that long, cold morning was that it had worked. The valley knew what to do. They found the plants without her pointing. They assessed ripeness without her checking. They harvested with the restraint she had taught, taking what was needed, leaving root systems intact for the following year, and they did it with a speed and efficiency that told her the knowledge had gone deep enough to hold under pressure. By mid-afternoon, the frost was thickening and the temperature dropping, and Maeve called the harvest in. She stood at the communal well and watched people come in from the fields, their baskets and bags heavy, their faces flushed with cold and exertion, and something that looked, in the low September light, remarkably like satisfaction. Raymond Cutler came in from the north slope with Frank Hadley, both of them carrying a pole between them from which hung 4 large cloth bags of dried ramp bulbs, preserved lamb's quarters, and ground plum pods. Raymond set his end of the pole down and looked at Maeve with an expression that had nothing complicated in it. "Where do you want these?" he asked. "The Hartley barn," she said. "We're storing everything communally until distribution next week." He nodded and picked the pole back up and kept walking. Maeve watched him go and thought about the man who had stood at her fence and demanded to know her qualifications. And then she thought about the man who had stood on the south slope and said, "I'm sorry," in the voice of someone who meant it. And she understood that these were the same man, that people contained their worst moments and their best ones simultaneously, and the only question was which one the circumstances called forward. The communal storage that evening held more than Maeve had projected, significantly more. She spent 2 hours cataloging it with Jessie's help, working by lantern light, and when the numbers were complete, she sat back on a hay bale and looked at them and felt the fear she had held since the early morning frost finally release its grip entirely. Every family in Ash Hollow would eat through winter. Not in comfort. Comfort had not been this valley's condition in any year she had known it, but adequately, nutritionally, without anyone going to bed with the particular hollow feeling of genuine insufficiency. Jessie looked at the same numbers and said with quiet precision, "We did it." "The valley did it," Maeve said. He looked at her with the directness that was one of his best qualities. "The valley did it because you taught them how. That's not the same as the valley doing it on its own." She didn't argue. She had learned over the course of this long summer to accept credit more gracefully than she had before, not as the performance of modesty, which she had never been particularly interested in, but as an honest accounting of what had happened and what her role in it had been. The knowledge was hers. The teaching was hers. The preparation and the persistence and the refusal to stop, even when families abandoned her sessions and anonymous threats appeared at her door and a rumor built itself into something that nearly dismantled everything. All of that was hers. The valley had done the work. She had made the work possible. Both things were true. Both things mattered. She had the conversation with Caleb that night, sitting at the kitchen table in the habit of the place where their most honest conversations had always happened. She laid out everything: Webb's letters, the Agricultural Society, the woman in Omaha, the shape of what she was beginning to see as possible. She talked for a long time without interruption, which was unusual for both of them. But Caleb had learned over the summer how to listen to her the way she needed to be listened to, fully, without constructing his response while she was still speaking. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. The frost had fully settled outside, and the house was making the small sounds houses make in cold, the tightening of wood, the settling of stone. "You want to go to other settlements?" Caleb said. Not a question. "Teach what you taught here." "Yes." "How long would you be away?" "I don't know yet. A season, maybe. Maybe longer, depending on what Dr. Webb's connections lead to." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking permission, Caleb. I'm asking you what you think. Those are different things." He was quiet again for a moment, and she respected the silence because she had learned that his silences were not evasions but actual thought. "I think," he said slowly, "that you spent 6 years in this valley being something this valley didn't know what to do with. And then in the space of one summer, you fed every family here and changed how this place understands itself." He looked at her. "And I think that if I asked you to keep that knowledge inside this one valley, I'd be doing to you what this valley did to you for 6 years, which is to look at something remarkable and decide it doesn't fit where you want to put it. She looked at her husband, this quiet, angular man who had spent 6 years being imperfect and the last 3 months becoming someone better, and felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but something between them, warm and solid. "I'd want you to come," she said. "When you can." "I will," he said. "When I can." A pause. "And when you go, I'll tend the valley. Make sure what you built here holds." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the cold kitchen, while outside the frost did what frost does. Settled over the ruined fields and the wild slopes, and the creek beds and the limestone ridges, covering everything equally, making the landscape look, in the moonlight, like something new. Winter passed the way it was going to pass, hard, cold, long, and slower than seemed possible at its beginning. But it passed without hunger. Every family in Ash Hollow moved through it with the preserved stores of that summer's harvest, supplementing whatever they had managed to save of their conventional crops, and what Maeve had calculated held, and what had seemed impossible in the panic days after the beetle emergence turned out to be not only possible, but sufficient. Daniel Pruitt grew 3 inches over the winter, which Dot attributed to the wild food with a conviction that brooked no argument and may or may not have been scientifically accurate, but was certainly emotionally satisfying. Pearl Burke learned to identify 14 species of edible plants from memory by January, a fact her father Herschel reported to anyone who would listen with a pride that had replaced, entirely and without acknowledgement, his previous position on the subject. Clara Voss organized a winter session indoors around Maeve's kitchen table, expanded to the Hartley sitting room when it outgrew the kitchen, in which women gathered weekly to dry and process stored materials and teach each other the preparation methods they had each individually learned, which meant the knowledge was no longer held in a single person's hands, but distributed across dozens of them. That had been Maeve's deepest hope from the beginning, though she had not said it aloud until the winter sessions were already established, that the knowledge would stop belonging to her and start belonging to everyone. A thing held by one person can be taken away. A thing held by 30 cannot. Edna Marsh came to the winter sessions. She came in December, the last of anyone to arrive, and she sat at the edge of the group with the careful positioning of someone who is present but not yet committed. She asked no questions the first week. The second week she asked one, very precisely, about the storage properties of dried watercress versus fresh. The third week she brought her own specimen for identification, a plant she had found at the edge of her property that she couldn't place. It was, in fact, a rare variety of wild carrot that Maeve had not previously documented in the valley. "Where exactly did you find this?" Maeve asked, examining it with a focus that made Edna blink. "The east fence line. There are several plants. I almost pulled them last spring." "I'm very glad you didn't," Maeve said. And then, because it was exactly true, and because Edna Marsh was watching her with the expression of someone waiting to be diminished, "This is a genuine find. I haven't seen this variety this far west before." She looked up. "Would you show me the location? I'd like to map it." Edna Marsh stared at her for a moment. Something passed across her face, complex, layered, the whole archaeology of a person confronting the gap between who they have been and who they might be. Then she said, in a voice that was careful but real, "Yes, I can do that." They went together on a Thursday morning in early February, the two of them walking the east fence line in the thin winter sunlight, Edna pointing out the plant stand and Maeve crouching to examine each specimen with her methodical attention. They did not speak about what had happened in the summer. There was no apology offered and none requested, because Maeve had come to understand that there were certain people for whom the act of coming back was the apology, and requiring explicit words on top of it was a kind of cruelty she wasn't interested in practicing. What they spoke about was the plant, its characteristics, its distribution, its potential yield in spring. Edna knew, without being told, that she had found something worthwhile, and she watched Maeve's notes with the attention of someone who has learned that careful observation has value. When Maeve finished and stood and brushed the frost from her knees, Edna said, "I could look for more, in places you haven't mapped yet." "I'd welcome that," Maeve said. Spring came, as spring always does, with the particular shock of it, the color, the sound, the smell of warming earth that every person who has survived a hard winter receives like a physical relief, a loosening in the chest that has been tight since October. The beetles did not return in the same numbers. The winter had thinned their population, and the valley's cultivated crops, planted again with care and hope, came up through the soft April soil in long green rows that made grown men and women stand at their field edges and feel things they couldn't quite put words to. But the valley planted differently this year. Between the rows, deliberately, families had left strips of undisturbed ground where wild plants could grow alongside the cultivated ones, a practice Maeve had suggested and that had been debated and ultimately adopted with the practical logic of people who had learned, at significant cost, the value of having a backup. The strips looked, to an outside eye, like disorder. To the people of Ash Hollow, they looked like sense. The first letter from the Agricultural Society arrived in March, forwarded through Webb. It was a formal inquiry, dry language, careful phrasing, asking whether Mrs. Holloway of Ash Hollow, Nebraska Territory, would be willing to contribute a written piece to their spring journal on the subject of wild edible plants in frontier settlements, and whether she might be available to speak at their June gathering in Omaha. Maeve read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then she set it down, and then she picked it up and read it again. Caleb, watching from across the table, said, "Well, they want me to speak in Omaha," she said. "I know. I read it over your shoulder." He paused. "Are you going to?" She looked at the letter. She thought about the woman in Omaha that Webb had mentioned, and the settlements she had never seen, and the families in those settlements who were living the way Ash Hollow had lived before the summer, walking past food they didn't know was there, dependent on a single method in a landscape that offered dozens. She thought about her grandmother in the Tennessee hills, and about knowledge that travels only as far as the person who carries it. "Yes," she said, "I'm going." She went in June. She rode with Webb's introduction in her bag and her field journal in her lap, and a case of specimens packed with the same precision she brought to everything. She was gone for 3 weeks, and she spoke to 47 people at the Agricultural Society gathering, and she answered questions for 6 hours across 2 days, and she left behind, with the woman in Omaha, a written curriculum for teaching wild plant identification and preparation, the first formal version of everything she had carried in her head since she was a girl in Tennessee. When she came back to Ash Hollow, it was late June, and the valley was in its full summer abundance, and Jesse Pruitt was running the weekly sessions at the creek with the confidence of someone who has genuinely learned something and knows it. He had added 2 identification methods she hadn't taught him, worked them out himself through his own observation, and when he showed her, she examined them carefully and said, "These are good, better than what I was using. I'm going to adopt them." Jesse looked at her with the expression of a young man who has just been told something significant by the person whose opinion he values most. He managed to receive it without falling apart, which she considered admirable. The summer passed, and then another summer, and Maeve's trips out of the valley became regular, 3-4 times a year, to settlements that Webb directed her toward or that had heard of her through the Agricultural Society Journal, in which she had now published 4 pieces that were being passed hand to hand in ways the journal's editors had not anticipated when they sent that first careful letter. She went as far north as the Dakota Territory one autumn, and as far south as Kansas in the spring, and everywhere she went, she found the same thing she had found in Ash Hollow: people living on the surface of a landscape they had never fully learned to read, one season of crop failure away from disaster, and a stubborn collective assumption that the land was only productive when it was cultivated. She changed that assumption everywhere she went, not quickly, and not without resistance, and not without the particular loneliness of being the person who knows something that others haven't learned yet. But she changed it. One family at a time, one settlement at a time, one woman crouching in a creek bed with a basket, and a patience that had been built over 26 years of being told she was wrong. The summer that Daniel Pruitt turned 11, he came to Maeve with a question. He had been studying her field journal. She had given him access to it the previous winter, which she had never done with anyone. And he had found a section on plant identification markers that he didn't fully understand, and rather than guess, he had come to ask. She sat with him on the front step in the evening light and explained it, and then she answered 3 more questions that led from the first. And then she asked him one in return, and they went back and forth until the light was nearly gone, and Dot Pruitt's voice was carrying across the fields with the particular tone that means supper is ready, and this is the last time you'll be called. Daniel stood to go. Then he stopped and looked at her with the serious, clear eyes that had been his since the first time she'd seen him examining watercress on a flat rock in the creek. "When I grow up," he said, "I want to know everything you know." Maeve looked at him. This boy who had been the center of the lie that nearly destroyed what she had built. This boy who had refuted that lie with her own teaching, quoted back with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention from the beginning. "You'll know more than I know," she said, "because you'll start from what I know, instead of starting from nothing." He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about everything. "That's how knowledge works," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly how it works." He ran toward his mother's voice, and the fading light swallowed him, and Maeve sat on the front step in the last of the evening and looked out at the valley. The pale limestone ridges, the long grass, the creek catching the last light, the fields now planted in their mixed patterns of cultivated rows and wild strips, looking nothing like the ordered sameness that had been Ash Hollow's definition of correct for 11 years. Looking, instead, like something alive. Caleb came out and sat beside her. He had done this more evenings than not since the summer of the Beatles, and she had come to consider it one of the reliable coordinates of her life. This man, this step, this light at the end of the day. "Letter from Webb," he said, holding it out. Came with the afternoon rider. She took it and read it in the failing light. Another invitation, another settlement, another community of people living beside food they didn't know was there. She folded it and held it in her lap. "Next month?" Caleb asked. "Next month," she said. He nodded and looked out at the valley with her. Below them, visible through the thin stand of ash trees that gave the hollow its name. A group of children were moving along the creek bank in the long evening shadow, baskets in hand, picking with the calm competence of people who know what they are looking for. She recognized Pearl Burke's red hair, and Jessie's younger sister, and 3 of the Garrity children, and Daniel Pruitt's distinctive straight-backed hurry moving ahead of all of them, already reaching for the next thing. They were talking as they worked, voices too distant to make out individual words, but the sound of it carried up the slope in fragments, a question, a correction, a laugh. Teaching each other. The knowledge moving between them the way it moves when it has been properly established. Not as a secret held by one person against the world, but as a common language, spoken freely, belonging to everyone who learns it. Maeve Holloway sat on her front step in the last light of a June evening and watched the children of Ash Hollow work the creek bank, and she felt the complete specific satisfaction of someone who has done exactly what they were meant to do with the years they were given. Not the satisfaction of being recognized, though recognition had come. Not the satisfaction of being vindicated, though vindication had come too. Something quieter than both of those. Something that didn't require an audience or a verdict. The satisfaction of knowledge that has found its way out of one person's hands and into the world, where no one can take it back. The valley settled into its evening sounds around her. The meadowlarks, the creek, the distant voices of children who knew the names of things. The limestone ridges held the last light a moment longer than the rest of the landscape, pale and steady above everything, the way they had always been and would continue to be long after everyone in this valley was gone, and other people had come, and the whole story had been absorbed into the land itself, which forgets nothing and eventually teaches everything to anyone patient enough to learn. She stayed on the step until the light was gone. Then she went inside, lit the lamp, and opened her journal to a fresh page. There was still so much to write down.